The merciless northern wind cut through Hjørdis's throat like an invisible blade, each breath forming desperate clouds of vapor that vanished into the gray void above. Snowflakes clung to her sweat-dampened skin despite the bone-deep cold, melting upon contact only to freeze again moments later. She stood alone in the small clearing, encircled by her clan, 40 pairs of eyes boring into her with contempt, disgust, and something worse, indifference. Their faces, once familiar, now seemed carved from the same unyielding stone as the mountains that imprisoned their village between sea and sky. Ulfric Brasso de Fer stood at the center of the human wall, his massive frame casting a shadow longer than his reputation. The iron bracelet that gave him his name caught what little light filtered through the storm clouds, gleaming dully against his scarred forearm. The clan chief's voice cut deeper than the wind when he finally spoke. "You no longer belong among us, child without honor." The words fell like stones into the silence. "The gods turn their faces from you, as we must now do." Hjørdis felt her knees weaken, though pride alone kept her standing. 16 winters she had survived, but this moment might be her last. The storm approaching from the western mountains would claim her before nightfall without shelter. She watched as one by one her people turned their backs. Aunts who had once cradled her, warriors who had trained alongside her father, children who yesterday had laughed at her stories. "I am Eirik's daughter," she whispered, though the wind stole her words. "I am of this clan." Ulfric's expression remained unmoved as he turned away, the final judgment delivered. The others followed, a procession of shadows retreating toward the village lights flickering in the distance. Hjørdis stood frozen, more from shock than cold, as the realization of absolute abandonment washed over her. Then came a sound, discordant at first, like the protest of ice breaking on the fjord. A melody, carried improbably against the wind. Heads turned, including Ulfric's, as a figure emerged from the tree line opposite the departing clan. He walked with the deliberate pace of one who had seen too many winters to rush, yet carried himself with unexpected dignity. Gray hair pulled back in a simple tail, face weathered like old leather, eyes dark and knowing beneath heavy brows. Across his back hung a worn lute, its wood polished by decades of handling. His furs, bare by the look of them, dragged slightly in the deepening snow. "What business brings you to Skjoldheim's judgment, old man?" Ulfric called, his hand instinctively finding the hilt of his blade. The stranger's voice, when it came, carried the rasp of countless sagas told around countless fires, yet possessed a strength that belied his years. "I come where the wind and stories take me, chieftain," he replied, eyes fixed not on Ulfric, but on the trembling girl at the center of the clearing. "I am Einar Svensson, called Olhos de Corvo by some. I seek shelter from the coming storm, and offer payment in tales older than your grandfather's grandfather." A Skald, a wandering keeper of histories and legends. Hjørdis had heard of such men, but rarely saw them this far north, especially with winter's grip tightening. Einar stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Hjørdis. "Though it seems I've arrived at an unfortunate moment." "You've walked into clan business, Skald," Ulfric warned. "This girl is banished for bringing ill fortune upon us. She is no longer of Skjoldheim." The old man's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then she belongs to no one," he said softly. and is free to choose her path. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. 24 hours earlier, dawn had barely touched the wooden watchtowers of Showdown when Hjørdis slipped from her sleeping pallet. The hearth fire had died to embers, casting the longhouse in shadows where other clan members still slumbered. She moved silently, wrapping her wolf-pelt cloak around shoulders too thin for a child of warriors. Outside, the village stirred reluctantly to life beneath a sky promising snow. Smoke rose from cooking fires, carrying the scent of porridge and yesterday's fish. Dogs barked, children were scolded, men gathered weapons for hunting. Normal sounds that once included her, but now flowed around her like water around a stone. Hjørdis made her way to the shore, where fishing boats lay overturned on the pebbled beach. The fjord stretched before her, a slate-gray mirror, reflecting mountains that seemed to hold up the very sky. Her breath fogged before her face as she knelt. Rough hands that knew the work of nets and healing herbs, plunging into the numbing water to wash away sleep. 7 months had passed since they'd brought her father's body home, pierced by 3 Frankish arrows. 7 months since the whispers began. The daughter of Erik Thorson, once respected for her knowledge of healing plants and skill with fishnets, had become something else entirely, a walking reminder of loss, a harbinger of misfortune. First came the failed fishing season, then the illness that took 3 elders, then the raid where 2 of their best warriors fell. With each calamity, eyes turned more frequently to Hjørdis. Some claimed Erik's death had been an omen ignored. Others whispered that his daughter carried a curse from her mother, a woman from another clan who had died bringing Hjørdis into the world. She dried her hands on her tunic and stood, gazing at the mountains. Would it be possible, she wondered, to find a place beyond them where she might be more than a mark of disgrace, where her name might be spoken without quiet superstition? Girl, the nets won't mend themselves while you stand dreaming. Gudrun, the boatmaster's wife, stood on the path above, her face pinched with disapproval and something like fear. Hjørdis nodded quickly and followed, knowing better than to speak. Words only gave people more reasons to find fault. The morning passed in silent labor, her fingers working the coarse rope with practiced skill. Other women kept their distance, speaking among themselves in hushed tones that occasionally broke into nervous laughter when she glanced their way. Children were pulled aside when she passed. Men ignored her completely. By midday, dark clouds had gathered over the fjord, bringing an early dusk to the village. Hjørdis finished her work and slipped away before Gudrun could find more tasks. Her stomach growled. She had missed the communal meal again, finding it easier than enduring the silence that fell whenever she approached the long tables. She made her way to the river that fed into the fjord, a place where she could be alone with thoughts that increasingly turned to escape. The water churned gray and angry between snow-dusted banks, carrying small ice floes out to sea. Hjørdis knelt at the edge, studying her reflection in a calm pool. A pale face framed by dark hair coming loose from its simple braid. Eyes the color of winter sky, a small scar on her right cheek from a childhood fall. Is it answers you seek in those waters, daughter of ice, or merely solitude? The voice, deep and weathered, startled her so badly she nearly toppled forward into the freezing current. Catching herself, Hjørdis spun around to face the stranger. He stood several paces away, leaning slightly on a gnarled walking stick. His gray hair was pulled back, revealing a face that had weathered decades of sun and wind. A scar, old and white, traced the left side of his forehead. Most striking were his eyes, dark as raven feathers, yet somehow bright with an inner light that belied his age. "I meant no alarm," he said, his voice carrying the cadence of distant shores. "I merely wondered why one so young sits alone by dangerous waters when a storm approaches." Hjørdis remained silent, wary of this stranger who had appeared from nowhere. Skjoldheim rarely received visitors in the winter months, when the mountain passes grew treacherous and the sea turned violent. The old man seemed unbothered by her silence. He shifted his weight, revealing the lute strapped to his back, its wood worn smooth by years of handling, decorative carvings faded but still visible along its neck. "You're a Skald," she said finally, recognition dawning. "A storyteller." He inclined his head. "Einar Svensson, at your service, though some call me Olhas de Corvo." He touched the corner of his eye with a weathered finger. "For these old eyes that see perhaps too much." "We have no need of stories here," Hjørdis said, turning back toward the water. "Skjoldheim has enough tales of its own." "Every place has stories," Einar agreed, stepping closer. "But I find it's often the people who need the tales, not the land." He studied her with those penetrating eyes. "Why do you hide here, daughter of ice?" The question struck too close to her heart. Hjørdis felt her throat tighten with emotion she refused to show. "I don't hide." "No?" His eyebrow raised. "Then why do your shoulders hunch as though bearing an invisible weight? Why do your eyes search the horizon as if for escape?" "You know nothing about me," she snapped, suddenly angry. "I know the look of one who stands apart," he said gently. "I have worn it myself for many winters." The simple understanding in his voice nearly broke her. Hjørdis felt tears threatening and blinked them fiercely away. Vikings did not weep, least of all before strangers. "They say I'm cursed," she finally whispered, the words torn from her against her will. "They say I bring ruin." The wind picked up, carrying the first snow flurries between them. Einar's face softened with a smile that held bitter sweetness. "Then let them live with their fears," he said. "Come with me. There is more world beyond the mountains that reject you." The invitation hung in the air, impossible yet tempting. Leave Skjoldheim, the only home she had ever known? Yet what home was this place that treated her like a disease to be avoided? "I cannot just—" she began, but a shout from the direction of the village interrupted her. "Hjørdis, where are you, girl? The chieftain summons everyone to the great hall." It was Gudrun again, her voice carrying a note of urgency. Hjørdis rose quickly, brushing snow from her cloak. "I must go," she said, already turning away. "We shall meet again, Hjørdis, daughter of Eirik," Einar called after her, "when the choice becomes clearer." She paused, surprised he knew her name and parentage, but there was no time to question him. The summons to the great hall could not be ignored. The great hall of Skjoldheim stood at the heart of the village, its massive timber frame rising higher than any other building. Carved dragon heads adorned its gables, their wooden eyes seeming to follow Hjørdis as she approached. Inside, firelight danced on shield-lined walls, casting long shadows across the packed earth floor where the clan gathered. Ulfric Bratza occupied the high seat, his massive frame draped in furs, iron bracelet gleaming on his forearm. His scarred face, marked by both battle and the pox that had taken his wife and son 3 winters past, remained impassive as the last stragglers entered. Beside him stood Thorald the Elder, whose clouded eyes saw visions of the gods, and Gunnar Longbow, the raid leader, whose voice carried weight second only to Ulfric's.
Hjørdis slipped in quietly, taking a place near the door where shadows might hide her. But Ulfric's cold grey eyes found her immediately. "Hjørdis, Eric's daughter," he called, his deep voice silencing all other conversation. "Step forward." A path cleared before her as people stepped aside, some making subtle protective gestures against ill fortune. Her legs felt suddenly weak, but pride forced her forward until she stood before the high seat, face upturned to meet Ulfric's gaze. "You know why you are called?" he asked, though it wasn't truly a question. "No, chieftain," she answered, her voice smaller than she intended. Ulfric's jaw tightened. 3 boats returned empty today. Fish that should fill our storehouses for winter swim elsewhere. Nets that should be heavy lie limp. He leaned forward. Hunting parties return with tales of game fleeing before them, as if warned. Murmurs rippled through the gathered clan. Hjørdis felt her heart pound against her ribs. "This follows the fever that took old Sigrid last week," continued Ulfric, "and the stillbirth of Frida's child." His voice hardened. "All since Eric's daughter returned from gathering herbs in the southern valley." "I've done nothing wrong," Hjørdis protested, though she knew it was futile. They weren't accusing her of actions, but of being. Thorald the Elder stepped forward, his blind eyes somehow finding her. "The gods speak through the world around us," he intoned. "When misfortune follows one person like a shadow, the message cannot be ignored." "I use the healing knowledge my father taught me," she said desperately. "I work the nets from dawn until dusk. I take only my share of food, less even." "It is not what you do," Gunnar Longbow cut in, his voice sharp as the arrows he crafted. "It is what you are." The word struck like physical blows. Hjørdis looked around the hall, searching for a single sympathetic face. She found none.
Even those who had known her since childhood lowered their eyes or looked away. "The winter grows harsh," Ulfric said, rising to his full, imposing height. "Our stores dwindle. The clan cannot bear further misfortune." He paused, and for just a moment something like regret flickered across his face. "The council has decided. You will leave Skoldheim at first light tomorrow." The pronouncement fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of reaction through the hall. Not surprise, they had expected this, but relief. Palpable, shameful relief. "Where would I go?" Hjørdis asked, her voice hollow. "Winter comes, the passes will soon be blocked with snow." "That," said Ulfric, already turning away, "is in the hands of the gods who have marked you." The clan meeting continued, moving on to other matters as if her fate were no more significant than the mending of a fence. Hjørdis stood frozen until Gudrun's husband roughly nudged her toward the door. Outside, night had fallen completely. Snow swirled more heavily now, driven by wind that moaned between the buildings like a restless spirit. Hjørdis walked blindly, her mind unable to grasp the reality of banishment. To be cast out in winter was a death sentence, if not from cold or hunger, then from wolves or raiders from rival clans.
Her feet carried her back to the river, though she scarcely noticed where she went. The water rushed darker now, carrying small ice floes that crashed and splintered against rocks. Like her life, breaking apart before her eyes. The choice becomes clearer now, I think. She wasn't surprised to find Einar waiting there, sitting on a boulder with his lute across his lap. In the fading light, his eyes seemed to gather what little brightness remained. "They've banished me," she said simply. Einar nodded, as if he had expected nothing less.
"And where will you go, daughter of Eirik?" Hjørdis looked out across the water, toward the mountains beyond which lay a world she had never seen. "There is nowhere. The winter—" "There is always somewhere," Einar interrupted gently. "The question is whether you have the courage to find it." "Courage?" A bitter laugh escaped her. "What courage is there in freezing to death alone in the forest, or being taken as a thrall by the first raiders who find me? The courage to believe your life holds more than what Showdown has decreed." Einar rose, slinging his lute across his back. "I have a shelter not far from here, simple but warm enough. You would be welcome there until we decide where the wind should carry us next." The decision wasn't easy. Hjørdis felt the pull of the only home she had known, even as it rejected her. The cold certainty of loneliness stretched before her like the frozen fjord. But against it stood this stranger, with his strange, knowing eyes, and the tantalizing promise of something beyond survival. Hope, thin as the light of the aurora dancing above the northern mountains, ultimately conquered despair. "Until the storm passes," she said finally, "then we shall see." Einar's smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Indeed we shall, Hjørdis Eriksdottir, indeed we shall." Taking Hjørdis to the hidden cabin among the pines required both courage and silence. They moved through the gathering storm like ghosts, skirting the edges of Skjoldheim where guard fires burned against the night. The girl followed Einar's lead, placing her feet carefully in his tracks where the snow had begun to accumulate in earnest. "Not much farther," he assured her as they climbed a gentle slope thick with ancient pines. "Just beyond that ridge." Hjørdis nodded, conserving her breath. The wind cut through her cloak, and her fingers had gone numb despite the mittens she wore. Each step took more effort than the last, as cold sapped her strength. Just as her legs began to tremble with exhaustion, the trees parted to reveal a small clearing. The cabin stood like a sentinel against the night, a simple structure of timber and stone, small but solid. Smoke curled from a hole in its peaked roof, promising warmth within. Hjørdis nearly wept at the sight. "You left your fire burning?" she asked through chattering teeth. Einar chuckled. "An old Skald learns tricks for comfort in his wanderings. Come, before the cold takes any more of your strength." Inside, the cabin was larger than it appeared. A single room with a central hearth where coals glowed red beneath a cooking pot. Furs lined the walls for insulation, and more were piled on a simple sleeping platform. A table and 2 chairs stood in one corner, while shelves held an assortment of provisions, scrolls, and small carved figures. Einar moved with practiced efficiency, adding wood to the fire until flames leapt high, casting dancing light throughout the space. He took Hjørdis's cloak, hanging it near the fire to dry, then pressed a wooden cup into her hands. "Drink," he instructed, slowly. The liquid was hot mead, mixed with something herbal and slightly bitter.
It spread warmth from her core outward as she sipped, bringing painful life back to her extremities. "You knew," she said suddenly, watching him over the rim of her cup. "You knew they would banish me." Einar paused in his preparations, meeting her gaze steadily. "I suspected. I have seen enough villages and enough fear to recognize the patterns." He stirred something in the pot hanging over the fire. "People seek simple answers to their misfortunes, a face to blame." "But why help me?" Hjørdis persisted. "You don't know me. I could bring the same ill luck to you." A smile ghosted across his weathered face. "Perhaps I don't believe in luck, ill or otherwise." He ladled stew into a wooden bowl and handed it to her. "Or perhaps I recognize something in you worth preserving." They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the storm's fury outside. Hjørdis felt tension gradually leaving her body as warmth and food restored her strength. When she had finished eating, she looked around the cabin more carefully. "These markings," she said, noticing runes carved into the main support beam. "They're protection sigils." Einar nodded, pleased. "You recognize them?" "My father taught me some. He said knowledge was as important as strength." The memory brought a pang of grief, still fresh despite the month since his death. "A wise man, your father." Einar rose and retrieved his lute from where it rested against the wall. "Would you like to hear a tale? It helps to pass the storm hours." Hjørdis nodded, settling more comfortably on the furs where she sat. Einar's fingers, surprisingly nimble for their weathered appearance, began coaxing a melody from the strings, something haunting that seemed to harmonize with the wind outside. "This is a tale older than Showdown," he began, his voice taking on a rhythmic quality. "Older than the oldest stones in its walls. It speaks of a time when gods walked more freely among men, and fate was a thread visible to those with eyes to see. The story unwound like a skein of fine yarn, drawing Hjørdis into a world where mortals and immortals entwined their destinies. Einar's voice painted images behind her eyelids, of Odin's wisdom and Thor's strength, of Freya's beauty and Loki's cunning. But woven throughout was a theme she had not expected, of mortals who changed their fates through courage and compassion rather than merely accepting what the Norns had woven. Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, Hjørdis let her fingers touch the strings of the lute when Einar offered it to her. The instrument felt alive beneath her hands, vibrating with possibilities as she discovered melodies that seemed to stitch together the wounded places in her spirit. As the night deepened and the fire burned lower, they shared more than music. Between sips of mead and meaningful silences, Hjørdis found herself speaking of things she had told no one, of her father's last words to her, of the growing isolation she had endured, of dreams that visited her on the darkest nights. "There is something I don't understand," she said finally, rolling back the sleeve of her tunic. "These marks on my wrist, I've had them since birth. My father said they were a gift from my mother before she died, but no one in Skjoldheim has markings like these." In the firelight, the subtle tattoos were visible, runes inked in a pattern that formed a continuous band around her left wrist. Einar leaned closer, his expression changing from curiosity to something more complex. "These are not common marks," he said quietly. "They tell a story of lineage, a very specific lineage." His dark eyes lifted to her face. "Did your father ever speak of your mother's people?" Hjørdis shook her head. "Only that she came from a clan to the east, beyond the mountains, that she was beautiful and skilled in herb lore." She hesitated. "He said her people had strange ways, but that she had chosen him freely." Einar sat back, his face troubled in the dying firelight. There are clans in the eastern valleys who keep to the old ways, the ways before the new gods began their slow march northward. They mark their children thus, to protect them and to remind them of their blood obligations. He touched one of the runes gently. This speaks of Skald, what shall be, and this one of Verdandi, what is becoming. What does it mean? Hjørdis asked, suddenly cold despite the fire's warmth. It means, Hjørdis, Eric's daughter, that you are not merely a child banished from a fearful clan. You are a link between past and future, a keeper of old knowledge that must not be lost. His voice grew solemn. It means your path was never meant to end in Showdown.
The revelation settled over her like fresh snow, transformative, covering the landscape of her understanding in new possibility. If what Einar suggested was true, then her banishment was not an ending, but a beginning, not a curse, but a liberation. But the winds of change were already stirring beyond their sheltered cabin. In Showdown, whispers of her disappearance had kindled new suspicions. The great hall of Showdown hummed with tension as warriors and hunters gathered in the pre-dawn hours. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving a world transformed by snow that gleamed blue-white in the early light. Ulfric Brasso de Ferro stood before the central fire, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the gathered men. She was to leave at first light, he growled, pacing like a caged bear. Yet her sleeping place is empty, her few possessions gone before the decree was even cold on my lips. Perhaps she fled into the night, suggested Gunnar Longbow, fearing what awaited her beyond our protection. Or perhaps, said Thorald the Elder, his blind eyes staring into the middle distance, something has taken her, something that recognized what we did not. A murmur passed through the assembly. Ulfric silenced it with a raised hand. What do you mean, old man? Speak plainly. Thorald's withered fingers traced patterns in the air. I dreamed of ravens last night. 2 ravens, watching our village from the tallest pine. Odin's eyes, seeing what we have overlooked. Riddles help no one, Ulfric snapped. The girl is gone. Good fortune for Showdown. And the stranger? Asked Bjarni Tanner, whose home stood nearest the village edge. The Skald who arrived yesterday, he too is gone this morning. The chieftain's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. What stranger? What Skald? An old man with a lute, Bjarni explained, shifting uncomfortably under Ulfric's sudden scrutiny. Gray-haired, with a scar on his brow. He asked for shelter, but when I returned from the meeting, he had vanished. Ulfric's face darkened like a thundercloud. And none thought to mention this wanderer to me? His voice rose. A stranger arrives the same day we banish the ill-luck child, and both disappear before dawn? Gunnar stepped forward, his hand already reaching for his axe. If this outsider has interfered with clan judgment, it is an offense against our laws and against the gods themselves. Worse, Thorald interjected, his voice quavering with age but firm in conviction. If he recognized what the girl truly is and has taken her eastward to her mother's people. What are you saying? Ulfric demanded, looming over the frail elder. Eric never spoke of his wife's clan, Thorald said. But I remember when he brought her here, a woman with strange markings on her skin and knowledge of plants that could heal or harm. Some whispered she was of the vulva bloodline. The word sent a chill through the hall. Vulva, women of power and prophecy, seers who walked between worlds. Not witches, precisely, but something other than ordinary mortals. You speak madness, Ulfric said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice.
The girl is simply a burden of ill fortune, nothing more. Then why would a wandering Skald take interest in her, countered Thorald, unless he saw what we did not? Ulfric's massive fist crashed down on the nearest table, making cups jump and spill. Enough. Whether she is cursed or blessed matters not. What matters is that clan judgment has been defied. That cannot stand. He turned to Gunnar. Take 6 men. Find their trail before the next snow covers it. Bring them back, the girl to face her banishment properly, the Skald to answer for his interference. And if they resist, Gunnar asked, though the gleam in his eye suggested he already knew the answer. Ulfric's scarred face was granite. Then the Skald will tell no more tales, and the girl's curse ends with her.
The approach to the cabin was silent as the night that preceded it. Under the pale light of the moon, armed men surrounded the small clearing, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Gunnar Longbow signaled with practiced gestures, positioning warriors at every possible escape route. The cabin's single window glowed with firelight, and smoke rose steadily from the roof hole, confirming occupancy. Inside, Einar paused in his storytelling, his weathered hand stilling the lute strings mid-note. His head tilted slightly, like a wolf scenting the air. "What is it?" Hjørdis asked, noticing the sudden tension in his posture. "We have visitors," he said quietly, setting the lute aside and rising to his feet. "Sooner than I expected." Fear clutched at Hjørdis's heart. "From Skjoldheim?" Einar nodded grimly. "Stay behind me." He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the simple wooden latch. "Whatever happens, remember what I told you about your mother's people. If things go poorly, head east at dawn. Follow the rising sun until you reach the forked river. The southern branch will lead you to those who will recognize your markings." Before Hjørdis could protest, Einar threw the door open and stepped outside, his tall frame silhouetted against the firelight behind him. "Good evening, hunters of Skjoldheim," he called into the darkness, his voice carrying a strength that belied his years. "You've traveled far through cold and snow. What brings you to my humble shelter?" Gunnar emerged from the shadows, flanked by 2 warriors with drawn weapons. His own bow remained across his back, but his hand rested on a hunting knife at his belt. "You know why we've come, old man," he said coldly. "The girl, she leaves with us now to fulfill the banishment decreed by our chieftain." Einar nodded grimly. "Stay behind me." He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the simple wooden latch. "Whatever happens, remember what I told you about your mother's people. If things go poorly, head east at dawn. Follow the rising sun until you reach the forked river. The southern branch will lead you to those who will recognize your markings." Before Hjørdis could protest, Einar threw the door open and stepped outside, his tall frame silhouetted against the firelight behind him. "Good evening, hunters of Skjoldheim," he called into the darkness, his voice carrying a strength that belied his years. "You've traveled far through cold and snow. What brings you to my humble shelter?" Gunnar emerged from the shadows, flanked by 2 warriors with drawn weapons. His own bow remained across his back, but his hand rested on a hunting knife at his belt. "You know why we've come, old man," he said coldly. "The girl, she leaves with us now to fulfill the banishment decreed by our chieftain." Einar spread his hands in a gesture of peace, though his stance remained firmly planted before the door. "The girl has already been banished, has she not? She walks no longer among your clan. What difference does it make if she shelters with me through the winter storms? She was to leave our territory entirely, Gunnar insisted. Not hide within reach of our village, protected by an interfering outsider. Ah, Einar nodded, as if considering this reasonable point. But I found her by the river, already outside your village bounds. She had, in fact, complied with your decree. Gunnar's patience visibly thinned. Enough word games, Skald. Stand aside, or be moved. The warriors beside him tensed, gripping their weapons tighter. She is not a burden to be discarded, Einar said, his voice dropping to a dangerous softness. She is a flame to be sheltered. If you wish to take her, you will have to pass through me. The challenge hung in the air between them, clear and unmistakable. For a moment, no one moved. Then a new figure emerged from the darkness, larger, more imposing than even Gunnar. Ulfric Brasso di Ferro stepped into the clearing, snowflakes settling on his dark hair and beard. His massive frame seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it, and the scar that ran down the right side of his face appeared as a shadow within shadow. I thought it best to witness this myself, he rumbled, when Gunnar did not return promptly. Einar's expression remained impassive, though his eyes narrowed slightly. Chieftain Ulfric, you honor my humble dwelling. Save your honey words, Skald. I have no taste for them. Ulfric moved forward until he stood directly before Einar, towering over the older man. You take what is not yours to take. You interfere in matters you do not understand. I understand more than you might think, Einar replied evenly. I understand fear dressed as judgment. I understand superstition masquerading as wisdom. Ulfric's hand shot out, faster than seemed possible for a man his size, gripping Einar's tunic. You dare? I dare to question whether a chieftain who fears a 16-year-old girl truly deserves to lead warriors, Einar interrupted, not struggling against the hold. The word struck like a physical blow. Ulfric's face contorted with rage, and he shoved Einar backward. The Skald stumbled, but kept his feet, positioning himself once more before the cabin door. The girl comes with us, Ulfric growled, and you will answer for your disrespect before all of Shildheim. No. The single word, quietly spoken but iron firm, came not from Einar, but from behind him. Hjørdis stepped through the doorway, her slight frame appearing fragile next to Einar's taller one. Yet something in her bearing had changed. She stood straighter, her chin lifted, her eyes, those winter sky eyes, clear and direct as they met Ulfric's. I have already been judged and banished, she said. Your authority over me ended with that judgment. I walk a different path now. Ulfric's laugh was harsh in the cold air. You walk no path at all, cursed child. You merely postpone the inevitable. These mountains forgive no one once winter takes hold. Yet here stands one who has walked these mountains for decades, Hjørdis countered, gesturing to Einar. Perhaps there are ways to survive you have not considered, chieftain. The mockery in the title was subtle but unmistakable. Ulfric's face darkened further, and his hand moved to the hilt of his sword. Enough of this, he snarled. Take them both. What followed was not merely a battle of bodies, but a duel of wills, where honor and fear collided with each swing of axe and thrust of blade. The warriors of Skjaldheim moved forward as one, confident in their superior numbers and strength. But they had not counted on Einar's surprising agility, nor the desperation that lent strength to Hjørdis's smaller frame.
The Skald moved with the fluid grace of one who had survived countless dangers, always keeping himself between Hjørdis and the advancing men. From beneath his cloak appeared a short sword, not the weapon of a warrior, but the practical defense of a man who traveled dangerous roads alone. "Stay back," he warned Hjørdis, parrying a thrust from one of Gunnar's men. But Ulfric had circled around, his greater reach allowing him to seize Hjørdis by her braid. She cried out as he dragged her away from Einar toward the waiting warriors. "Your protector bleeds for nothing," the chieftain hissed in her ear. "See how age makes fools of even the clever ones." Indeed, Einar had taken a glancing blow to the temple from a warrior's axe handle. Blood streamed down his face, catching in his beard. He stumbled, momentarily dazed, as two men closed in. Something inside Hjørdis shifted at the sight, a tectonic movement of spirit that brought to the surface a courage she had buried beneath years of submission. With strength born of desperation, she twisted in Ulfric's grasp and drove her elbow hard into his stomach. The chieftain grunted in surprise more than pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to wrench free. Her eyes fell on a hunting spear that had fallen in the snow during the melee. Without hesitation, she snatched it up, whirling to face Ulfric with the point leveled at his chest. "Enough," she shouted, her voice carrying a newfound authority that brought all movement in the clearing to a sudden halt. Even Ulfric paused, momentarily startled by the transformation in the girl, who had always been shadow-quiet in his presence. Blood from a cut on her cheek mingled with melted snow, trailing down her neck like war paint. "Would you kill your chieftain, girl?" he asked, a dangerous edge in his voice. "Prove to all that the curse they feared runs true in your blood?" "I would defend what is mine by right," she answered steadily. "My freedom, my path, my choice of companion." The spear point never wavered. "You have cast me out. You cannot then claim the right to dictate where I go or with whom." Einar had regained his feet, blood still flowing freely from his temple wound. He moved to stand beside Hjørdis, his sword lowered but ready. "The girl speaks truth, Ulfric Brasso de Ferro," he said. "By your own laws, once banished, she belongs to no clan and answers to no chieftain. She is free to find her own way, or to follow mine." Ulfric's gaze moved between them, calculation replacing blind rage in his cold eyes. The other warriors hung back, awaiting his command, but clearly unsettled by this unexpected resistance. "You speak of our laws," he said finally, "yet you know nothing of our struggles. This girl's presence has brought nothing but misfortune since her father fell. Fish flee our nets, game eludes our hunters, sickness stalks our elders." "And you believe removing one girl will change this?" Einar asked quietly. "That the gods are so small-minded they would punish an entire clan for the existence of a single motherless child?" The question hung in the air like frost crystals, delicate but cutting. Ulfric's certainty seemed to waver for the first time. "What would you have us do? Watch our children starve when winter deepens? Accept that our bad fortune is meaningless chance?" "I would have you look elsewhere for the source of your troubles," Einar replied. "Perhaps to the changing patterns of the fish with the colder waters this year, or to the new settlement 2 valleys over that has driven game from your traditional hunting grounds,
or to the fact that your oldest healer died last spring, taking her knowledge with her because pride prevented her from training a successor. Each point struck home like a well-aimed arrow. Murmurs arose among the warriors, some nodding reluctantly at truths they had perhaps considered but not voiced.
"And I would have you consider," Einar continued, pressing his advantage, "that this girl, whom you so fear, carries knowledge of healing herbs that might save lives when sickness next visits Skjoldheim. That her hands are skilled with nets that might be mended differently to catch the fish that now elude you. That her eyes see patterns others miss." Hjørdis stood frozen, the spear still extended, scarcely breathing as Einar's words washed over her. Never had anyone spoken of her with such confidence, such certainty of her worth. "You ask us to ignore the judgment already passed?" Ulfric said, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. "I ask you to consider whether that judgment served wisdom or fear," Einar corrected, "and whether a leader's true strength lies in maintaining a flawed decision or in having the courage to reconsider." The silence that followed was more eloquent than 1,000 battles. Ulfric stood immobile, his massive frame outlined against the snow, the weight of leadership visible in the set of his shoulders. Finally, he exhaled heavily, his breath a cloud that dissipated in the cold night air. "Lower your weapon, girl," he said, though the command lacked its earlier force. "We will speak further of this matter." Hjørdis hesitated, looking to Einar, who gave a slight nod. Slowly, she lowered the spear, though she did not relinquish her grip entirely. "Your men are cold and some are wounded," Einar said pragmatically. "The cabin is small, but the fire is warm. Perhaps discussion would be better conducted out of this bitter night." It was a peace offering, carefully phrased, to allow Ulfric to accept without losing face. After a moment's consideration, the chieftain nodded curtly. "Gunnar, set a watch. The rest may warm themselves." His eyes remained fixed on Hjørdis. "This changes nothing yet, but I will hear what more the Skald has to say." As the warriors filed cautiously into the cabin, Hjørdis felt something shift within her. Not just fear giving way to tentative hope, but a deeper recognition. For the first time in her life, she had stood her ground, not in silent endurance, but in active defense. She had claimed her place in the world, spear in hand. The battle was far from over, but in that moment, beneath the cold stars that watched impassively overhead, Hjørdis Eriksdottir took the first step on a path that was truly her own. When the dust settled and tempers cooled, Ulfric sat opposite Einar at the small table in the cabin's corner. Between them rested a flask of strong mead that the Skald had produced from his stores, a peace offering that the chieftain had accepted with grudging appreciation. The other warriors huddled near the fire, some tending minor wounds, others simply absorbing the blessed warmth after hours in the bitter cold. Hjørdis moved quietly among them, applying herbal poultices to cuts and binding what needed binding. Her hands worked with practiced efficiency, her eyes downcast, but her back straight. No longer cowering, no longer invisible, each movement deliberate and purposeful. "The girl has skill," Ulfric observed, watching as she expertly dressed a gash on a young warrior's forearm. "As I said," Einar replied mildly, touching the bandage Hjørdis had applied to his own temple wound. "There is more to her than misfortune." Ulfric took another swallow of mead, his scarred face thoughtful in the firelight. "You speak as one who has seen many villages, many customs. Tell me truly, Skald, have you witnessed such things before? Children who seem to carry ill fortune like a shadow?"
Einar considered the question carefully. I have seen people blamed for coincidences. I have seen fear turn neighbors against each other when crops fail or sickness comes. He leaned forward slightly. But I have also seen how such fear can blind people to the true causes of their troubles and to the strengths that might help them overcome those troubles. You think us blind, then? There was an edge to Ulfric's voice, but curiosity too. I think all men have blind spots, Einar answered diplomatically, even those with the wisdom to lead. The chieftain's gaze shifted to Hjørdis again. The markings on her wrist, Thorald spoke of them, said they might be signs of vulva blood. The old man sees clearly for one whose eyes are clouded, Einar acknowledged. The girl's mother came from a clan that keeps old ways, old knowledge. The markings are protection and reminder both. Protection against what? Against forgetting who she is, Einar's dark eyes held Ulfric steadily. Against becoming less than she was born to be. The chieftain's massive hand tightened around his cup. And what was she born to be, in your reckoning? That, said Einar with the hint of a smile, is for her to discover. But I do not think it includes freezing to death as an outcast or serving as a convenient explanation for Skjoldheim's troubles. Ulfric fell silent, the conflict evident in his face. He was a practical man, a warrior who had risen to leadership through strength and cunning. Superstition and mysticism sat uneasily with his nature, yet he could not entirely dismiss the beliefs that had sustained his people through generations of hardship. If she returns, he said finally, each word measured, there will be those who still fear her, who will blame her for every misfortune, great or small. Then perhaps it falls to the chieftain to lead by example, Einar suggested, to demonstrate through action that wisdom sometimes requires us to reconsider our judgments. Ulfric's jaw tightened, but he did not immediately reject the idea.
His gaze traveled around the cabin, to his men warming themselves, to Hjørdis moving among them with quiet competence, to the small comforts that made this isolated shelter a haven against the winter's fury. And if misfortunes continue, he asked, a final test, then you seek their true causes with the same determination you would bring to hunting or battle, Einar replied, not settling for the easiest explanation, but pursuing the truth wherever it leads. Something like respect flickered in Ulfric's cold eyes. He drained the last of his mead and set the cup down with finality. We return to Skjoldheim at first light, he announced, raising his voice so all could hear. All of us. The warriors looked up in surprise. Hjørdis froze in the act of securing a bandage, her eyes widening. Chieftain? Gunnar questioned, clearly confused by this apparent reversal. The girl returns with us, Ulfric clarified. The judgment is suspended. We will observe and consider further. His gaze found Hjørdis across the room. She will resume her duties and her place. Any who treat her with less than the respect due a clan member will answer to me. The pronouncement settled over the gathering like fresh snow, transforming the landscape completely. Hjørdis stood motionless, disbelief written plainly across her features. And the Skald? Asked Gunnar, glancing at Einar. He comes as our guest, Ulfric decided, to share his tales through the dark winter nights, and perhaps his wisdom as well. Einar inclined his head in acknowledgement, though his expression remained carefully neutral. I am honored by the invitation, Chieftain Ulfric, though I must warn you, my tales are not always comfortable to hear. A grim smile touched Ulfric's scarred face. Few worthwhile things are comfortable, Skald.
I have learned that much in my years." As the others settled in to rest before the journey back to Skjoldheim, Hjørdis approached the table hesitantly. Her face was a study in conflicting emotions, relief warring with uncertainty, hope tempered by lingering fear. "You don't have to return," Einar told her quietly. "The path eastward remains open to you." She glanced at Ulfric, who had moved away to speak with Gunnar. "Do you trust his word, that I will truly have a place again?" "I trust that he is a man capable of growth," Einar replied. "Whether that growth comes quickly enough or extends far enough for your needs, that I cannot say." Hjørdis traced the runes on her wrist, her expression thoughtful. "My father always said that running solves nothing, that true strength comes from facing what frightens you." "Wise words," Einar agreed, "though there is also wisdom in knowing when a battle cannot be won." She squared her shoulders, decision crystallizing in her eyes. "I will return, not as the shadow girl they pitied or feared, but as myself, whatever that may truly be." Einar's weathered face creased in a genuine smile. "Then I shall witness your becoming, Hjørdis Emmek's daughter. It promises to be a tale worth telling." When the small party emerged from the forest edge into view of Skjoldheim the next day, the village seemed to hold its collective breath. Word had spread quickly of Ulfric's mission to retrieve the banished girl and deal with the interfering Skald. No one had expected to see the chieftain return with both walking freely at his side, nor the absence of tension in the warriors who accompanied them. The clan gathered in the open area before the great hall, their faces registering various degrees of confusion, suspicion, and curiosity. Mothers pulled children closer, elders muttered among themselves, and warriors gripped their weapons uncertainly, looking to Ulfric for guidance. The chieftain stepped forward, his imposing presence immediately commanding attention. Beside him stood Hjørdis, her face composed despite the scrutiny, and Einar, observing the proceedings with the detached interest of one who had witnessed many such moments in many such villages. "People of Skjoldheim," Ulfric began, his deep voice carrying easily to the furthest listener. "You see before you Hjørdis Eriksdottir, whom we judged and banished as a bringer of misfortune." Murmurs arose, quickly silenced by Ulfric's raised hand. "You also see Einar Svensson, a Skald of renown, who travels the northern lands. It was he who questioned our judgment, not with weapons, but with words that cut more deeply than any blade." He paused, clearly choosing his next words with care. "Words that forced me to consider whether our troubles spring from the presence of one girl, or from our own blindness to their true causes." Thorald the Elder pushed forward through the crowd, his clouded eyes seeming to fix on Hjørdis despite his blindness. "The chieftain speaks of blindness to one who knows its meaning well," he said, his voice quavering with age. "Perhaps he has seen what I glimpsed only in dreams, that this child carries more than our projections of misfortune." "She carries knowledge," Ulfric confirmed, "of healing, of fishing, of the old ways that sustained our ancestors through harsher winters than this. Knowledge we would have cast away in our fear." The crowd stirred uneasily. It was one thing to hear that a judgment had been reconsidered, quite another to hear their chieftain admit to fear. "What of the ill fortune that has plagued us?" called a voice from the back. "The empty nets, the sickness, the failed hunts." "These troubles remain," Ulfric acknowledged. but we will face them as warriors and survivors, not as frightened children seeking simple answers. We will look to the changing patterns of fish and game, to the encroachment of other settlements, to the knowledge we have neglected." His gaze swept the assembly. "And we will remember that strength lies not in casting out the vulnerable, but in finding how each member of the clan contributes to our survival." It was a profound shift, not just in policy, but in philosophy. Some faces showed relief, others skepticism, still others outright disagreement. Skjoldheim would not transform overnight. Old fears and superstitions would not vanish with a single speech. But a seed had been planted, a possibility introduced that might, with care and patience, grow into something stronger than fear. "The girl returns to her place among us," Ulfric concluded, "and the Skald joins us as an honored guest for the winter. Any who cannot abide these decisions are free to speak to me directly." The challenge in his tone made it clear how such conversations might proceed. As the crowd dispersed, returning to the daily tasks that sustained life in the harsh northern climate, Hjørdis found herself approached by those who had once avoided her. Some offered awkward welcomes, others simply nodded acknowledgment of her presence. A few, mostly children and the very old, smiled genuinely, as if a weight had been lifted from them as well. Gudrun, the boatmaster's wife, who had been among the most vocal in attributing misfortunes to Hjørdis's presence, stopped before her with hands twisted in her apron. "My life's nets need mending," she said stiffly. "Your hands were always clever with the knots." It wasn't an apology, but it was an offering, a task that acknowledged skill rather than superstition. Hjørdis inclined her head in acceptance. "I'll see to them before sundown," she promised. As the day progressed, Hjørdis moved through the village with a new awareness. She was not suddenly beloved, nor had suspicion entirely vanished. But the weight of total rejection had lifted, allowing her to stand straighter, to meet eyes that previously had avoided hers, to exist as a person rather than a symbol of misfortune. That evening, in the great hall where her banishment had been pronounced just days before, she sat not in shadows by the door, but at a table near the central fire. Beside her, Einar prepared his lute, testing strings and adjusting tension with practiced fingers. The hall filled gradually as the day's work ended, people drawn by curiosity about the Skald and his tales as much as by the promise of warmth and food. Ulfric occupied his high seat, observing the gathering with the measured gaze of a leader taking stock of his people. When the hall had filled and the evening meal was done, he rose, commanding immediate silence. "We welcome Einar Svensson, who brings tales from beyond our mountains," he announced. "Listen well, for knowledge comes in many forms, and wisdom often wears the cloak of simple stories." He gestured to Einar, who stood and moved to the open space before the fire. The Skald's weathered face gleamed in the firelight, his dark eyes reflecting flames as he surveyed his audience. "I thank you for your hospitality, people of Skjoldheim," he began, his voice carrying easily to the hall's furthest corners. "The tale I share tonight is ancient, born in the time when our ancestors first set foot on these shores. It speaks of a woman who carried both blessing and burden, whose presence brought change that some feared and others embraced. The story unwound like a skein of fine yarn, drawing the listeners into a world both familiar and strange. Einar's voice painted images in the air, of storms and stillness, of courage and fear, of a clan that nearly destroyed itself through blindness to its own strengths. Throughout the telling, his fingers coaxed music from the lute that seemed to give voice to the emotions his words evoked: sorrow and joy, tension and release, despair and hope. Hjørdis watched the faces around her as they listened, how they leaned forward during moments of suspense, how smiles or frowns appeared in response to the tale's turns, how even the most skeptical were gradually drawn into the world Einar created. She realized with sudden clarity that this was the Skald's true power, not merely to entertain, but to allow people to experience perspectives not their own, to feel truths they might otherwise reject. When the tale concluded, a hush held the hall for several heartbeats before conversation gradually resumed. Einar returned to his seat beside Hjørdis, accepting with gracious nods the compliments offered by those nearby. They heard, he said quietly to her. Not all understood, not all believed, but they heard. Will hearing be enough? She asked, watching as the hall began to empty, people returning to their homes for the night's rest. It is a beginning, Einar replied. Change comes slowly to villages like this, rooted deep in tradition and survival, but it comes nonetheless. As the fire burned lower, and the great hall emptied of all but a few stragglers, Einar reached into his pack and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. He placed it in Hjørdis's hands. For you, he said, a tool for your journey. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a writing quill and a small pot of ink, both clearly well-crafted and valuable. Alongside them lay a piece of smooth birch bark, prepared for inscription. I don't understand, she said, looking up at him in confusion. Every tale must have a teller, Einar explained, even yours, especially yours. Hjørdis ran her fingers over the quill's soft feather. You want me to write my story? I want you to claim it, he corrected gently, not as victim, but as author. The marks on your wrist speak of heritage, but they do not dictate your path. That remains for you to discover and record. The gift was more profound than it appeared. Not merely implements for writing, but an invitation to self-determination. To see her life not as something that happened to her, but as something she actively shaped. Thank you, she whispered, carefully rewrapping the precious items. Einar's smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. The thanks will come when I hear the tales you choose to tell, Hjørdis Eriksdottir. I suspect they will be worth the journey that brought me here. In the days that followed, Skildheim slowly adjusted to Hjørdis's renewed presence among them. Old habits of avoidance gradually gave way to cautious inclusion. When she joined the fishing boats and suggested new locations based on her observations of bird movements, the initial skepticism turned to grudging respect, as nets came up fuller than they had in weeks. When sickness visited the home of a young family, her knowledge of healing herbs brought relief where traditional remedies had failed. Einar remained as promised, sharing tales each evening that subtly challenged perspectives and expanded horizons. Some stories spoke of distant lands and unfamiliar customs, others of the gods and their complex relationships with mortals. But woven throughout was a consistent theme, that strength came in many forms, that wisdom often wore unexpected faces, that survival depended as much on adaptation as on tradition. Winter deepened around Skjoldheim, snow piling against walls and drifting across paths that required daily clearing. The fjord froze near its edges, though the center remained open water, dark and forbidding.
Inside the wooden buildings, life continued, mending, carving, weaving, planning for the spring that seemed impossibly distant. Hjørdis found herself increasingly sought out, not just for her practical skills, but for her company. Children who had once been kept from her now gathered to hear the smaller tales she told, inspired by but distinct from Einar's grander sagas.
Young warriors asked her to identify plants that might be useful on long journeys. Even Gudrun, still stiff with residual suspicion, grudgingly acknowledged that the girl's hands brought luck rather than misfortune to the tasks she undertook. Through it all, Hjørdis observed and recorded. In quiet moments, she practiced with Einar's gift, learning to form runes and words on prepared bark, and later on precious scraps of parchment the Skald shared from his own stores. She wrote of small moments, the way sunlight broke through clouds after days of storm, the sound of children's laughter echoing across the frozen fjord, the satisfaction of a well-mended net or a successfully treated fever. And gradually she began to write her own story, not just the recent drama of banishment and return, but the deeper narrative of a child born between worlds, carrying heritage she was only beginning to understand. Einar read these efforts, offering guidance on clarity and structure, but never altering the heart of what she chose to express. "You have a voice," he told her one evening as they sat by the fire in the small hut that had been allocated to him. "Distinct and true. The world has need of such voices." "Even the voice of one girl from a small northern village?" she asked, skepticism coloring her tone. "Especially such voices," he assured her. "The great sagas remember kings and heroes, but it is the quiet stories of ordinary lives that truly teach us how to be human." Winter began its slow retreat as days lengthened almost imperceptibly. Icicles dripped during daylight hours before refreezing at night. Birds returned from southern migrations. The air carried hints of change beneath its lingering chill. With spring's approach came the inevitable question of departures. Einar had remained far longer than his usual practice, and though none spoke of it directly, all knew the wandering Skald would soon continue his journey. What none yet knew, including Hjørdis herself, was whether she would remain in Skjoldheim or follow the path eastward to her mother's people. The question resolved itself on the first truly warm day, when the sun broke through clouds that had lingered for weeks and transformed the village into a place of light and shadow. Hjørdis stood in the clearing where, months before, she had faced banishment and despair. Now wildflowers pushed through melting snow, and birdsong replaced the howling wind that had nearly claimed her life. Einar joined her there, his pack already prepared for travel, his lute secured across his back. They stood in companionable silence, watching a pair of ravens circle overhead before disappearing beyond the mountain ridge. "You've decided then," he said, not a question, but a recognition. Hjørdis nodded, her hand unconsciously tracing the runes on her wrist. "I'll remain here through summer and autumn, learn what more I can from the elders who now speak to me freely, record their knowledge before it's lost." She turned to face him directly. "But when winter approaches again, I'll journey east, find my mother's people, learn what they can teach me as well." "A wise path," Einar approved, "building bridges rather than burning them." "Will I see you again?" she asked, unable to keep a note of wistfulness from her voice. The old Skald smiled, the expression warming his weathered face. "The world has many roads, Hjørdis Eriksdottir, but they cross more often than one might expect. I suspect our paths will indeed meet again." "I'll have stories for you when they do," she promised. "Of that I have no doubt." He reached out, clasping her forearm in the traditional warrior's grip. "Remember what I told you that first night.
You are not merely a child banished from a fearful clan. You are a link between past and future, a keeper of old knowledge that must not be lost. Hjørdis returned the grip firmly. I won't forget. They walked back to the village together, where others waited to bid the Skald farewell. Ulfric stood at the forefront, his massive frame no less imposing for the respect now evident in his bearing. Skjoldheim owes you a debt, Einar Svensson, the chieftain acknowledged, for seeing what we could not, or would not, see. The debt is paid by your willingness to look anew, Einar replied. Not all leaders possess such courage. The farewell was brief, as suited a people who faced separation and loss as constants in their harsh existence. Gifts were exchanged, provisions and a finely carved knife for the Skald, promises of welcome should he return. Then Einar turned to the path that would take him south and west, toward villages that awaited his tales and wisdom. Hjørdis watched until his figure disappeared among the trees, then turned back to Skjoldheim, to the tasks and relationships that would fill her days until her own journey began. She was no longer the shadow girl who slipped along walls and avoided eyes, nor was she the outcast who faced banishment in desperate silence. She was becoming something new, something that combined her father's practical strength, her mother's mysterious heritage, and her own hard-won wisdom. The path ahead held uncertainty, as all paths did in this unpredictable world. But it was her path, chosen rather than imposed, and that made all the difference. In the clearing where it all began, beneath a star-filled sky that had witnessed her fall and rise, Hjørdis felt the firm hand of the Skald on her shoulder. Snow no longer seemed a punishment, but a sacred blanket covering those who dared to be reborn. That day, between fire and ice, they understood that compassion can be the strongest weapon a Viking possesses, Einar had told the gathered clan on his final night in Skjoldheim. Stronger than blade or bow, more enduring than shield or wall, for it builds what force cannot: trust, loyalty, community. The words echoed in Hjørdis's mind as she stood alone in the moonlight, quill in hand, the blank page before her awaiting the next chapter of her tale. Behind her lay Skjoldheim, transformed by a winter of change. Before her stretched the unknown, the eastern mountains, her mother's people, mysteries yet to be unraveled. She began to write, her strokes confident and clear. I am Hjørdis Eriksdottir, daughter of the north wind and the eastern stars. This is my saga, told in my own voice. Listen, if you will, to a tale of banishment and belonging, of fear overcome by courage, of a girl who died in the snow and was reborn in firelight. The runes on her wrist seemed to pulse with their own subtle light as the quill moved across the page, not guiding her hand, but reminding her of who she was and who she might become. Author of her own destiny, bridge between worlds, keeper of knowledge both old and new. In that moment, between earth and sky, past and future, Hjørdis understood at last what Einar had seen in her from the beginning. Not a curse to be feared, but a flame to be sheltered until it could burn on its own, casting light where once there had been only shadow. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.